Good evening and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Sudaso and I'm here with Bhante Wade, and we'll be taking any questions that people have related to Buddhism. So feel free to type in questions, and as we see questions then we will respond to them, and when the questions stop then we will stop. So we'll start with paying homage to the Buddha, and then if there's any questions then we'll start answering questions. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Okay, and hello to the people checking in online. Hello to John, Wiseman, Leilani, Kim, Kumu, Manal, Moraya, Karuna, and John. And John has a question. John says, why is only tanha mentioned in the first discourse when there are 3 unwholesome roots? Well, so the Dhammacakkappavattana, he carries on, he asks, is tanha the root of the other 2? So the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta is particularly focused on the Four Noble Truths, and the formulation of the Four Noble Truths is the first truth, which is that there is dukkha, the second, which is that dukkha is caused by desire, by craving, by tanha. Third one is that the ending of tanha is the ending of dukkha. And the fourth one is that by practicing the Noble Eightfold Path, we can come to a complete ending of tanha, and therefore a complete ending of dukkha. So yes, that is only directly, specifically mentioning tanha, desire, craving. However, it is understood that aversion is a manifestation of tanha. Aversion is a form of desire. So wanting to avoid or eliminate or get rid of something is another form of wanting. And that both desire and aversion arise from delusion. So the underlying cause of desire is delusion. And therefore, if one is practicing to get rid of desire, then one ultimately needs to work on delusion. And this is more clearly specified in the Noble Eightfold Path. So in fact, the very first element of the Eightfold Path is samaditthi, right view, which is directly targeting the problem of delusion, of ignorance. So yes, the other 2 unwholesome roots are not so specifically mentioned, but they are implied by the Four Noble Truths in the Eightfold Path. So John says, is tanha the root of the other 2? It's actually the other way around. So delusion is the root of the other 2. Delusion is the root of both desire and aversion. And Rebecca says, what is the meaning of let them be able and upright in the Metta Sutta? I wonder how people with disabilities might feel hearing this, even if it's not meant to be discriminatory. So this is always the problem with translations, and doubly so with translations in chanting books. So we have what is written in the Pali text, which has a very clear and specific meaning in the Pali language. And then in attempting to translate that into modern languages, then the meaning inevitably gets altered a little bit. And in a course of taking an ancient text and trying to make it into something pleasant and agreeable for chanting, then it usually gets further modified for the sake of poetic or musical quality. So this is an example of that. So the line, let them be able and upright, I think is a particularly inaccurate translation of the Pali line. So let's see, Karaniya Matakusalena Yantang Santang Paranga Bisameja Sakko Uju Chasuhuju. So the Pali words are uju and suhuju, which are both from the word uju. The word uju has the sense of upright, so morally upright. So in the sense that one is has a high moral standard, and also it has the sense of direct or straightforward. So uju also means direct or straightforward in the sense that one is practicing in a very direct, straightforward, and clear way. But also it has the meaning of direct and straightforward in the sense of not being deceitful or fraudulent. So being direct and straightforward also in how one communicates to others and how one relates to others. So not being secretive or deceptive, but instead being straightforward and direct. And it's interesting, by the way, that that's included in a discourse on loving kindness, because there's often this idea that in order to save face and not hurt people's feelings, that we should be very vague and indirect and roundabout in communication. But actually the Buddha seems to be saying something quite the opposite, that actually in the cultivation of kindness and compassion, it's important to be clear and straightforward. And learning how to be clear and straightforward while also being kind and gentle is an important part of Buddhist practice. So that's the word uju. So uju meaning morally upright, direct and straightforward. And suhuju is the same word, but with the prefix su, which means very, or extremely, or really well, or really good. So we should not just be morally upright and straightforward, we should be extremely morally upright and very straightforward, very direct and clear. So the translation able and upright, able in particular, I just don't get. Like, I don't get how you can take the word uju and translate it as able. That just doesn't make any sense at all. Translating either uju or suhuju as upright is okay, as long as one understands that it's talking about being morally upright. And neither translation, able or upright, neither one captures the sense of direct and straightforward. So yeah, it's just an example of a misleading translation, which is not very good. And I mean, ultimately, if one wants to understand the meaning of a text, at a bare minimum, you should compare multiple translations of the same text. And ideally, you should learn Pali and read them in Pali. They're so much clearer in Pali. Okay, and Wise Man says, I go through phases where I am actively listening to Dhamma talks and establishing a daily meditation practice. However, there are times when I fall off my routine for days to weeks. Any strategies to ground myself and get back into routine without judging myself? Bhante Wade, what do you think?
Okay. Well, this is actually quite normal in meditation practice for people, I think, especially in worldly life, where you have so many other things going on, and life isn't necessarily oriented around things like meditation practice or studying the Dhamma. Here in monastic life, of course, we have the benefit of structuring our lives around these kinds of things. But I hear this quite commonly from people in lay life, and I experience this myself also in lay life as well. And so, in terms of not judging yourself, perhaps if we start there, I remember reading years ago a story in a magazine about New Year's resolutions. This was leading into the Christmas and New Year season, so perhaps it's very appropriate now as well, since we're getting into those seasons right now as well. And I found this advice very applicable for this kind of thing. I think the advice was that people are more successful in keeping their New Year's resolutions when they bear in mind, when they have it in mind, and they understand that it's normal to mess up sometimes. Normal to kind of fall out of the routine you were hoping to establish, the new habit you're trying to do. This is just human nature. And if you take it in stride as this is something that's going to happen and this is normal, then it's not. Then you don't feel so bad about it, and you're more likely to get back on track. But if you feel like, well, something really bad has happened, and that I've fallen out of, my promise or my resolution, and then you're less likely to get back on track because you think you've failed. You're not going to be able to succeed. So actually simply changing your perspective on it can help a lot in terms of being successful in the long run. I think in terms of staying with it, it can help to have some variety in your meditation practice. They say that one factor that's very helpful in leading a fulfilling life in general is having some variety in your life. And I think this can apply to meditation practice as well. So if you normally practice breath meditation, for example, a very common meditation style, perhaps also see if you should practice some loving kindness sometimes, or perhaps one of the inspiring themes like recollection of the Buddha or recollection of your own good deeds. And this can add some spice to the practice and be very uplifting, and help the mind to feel more interested in meditation practice. Ajahn Chah had a simile for this. He said, well, actually, I'll tell you the reverse first. He said, if you try digging for water in many different locations, digging a little bit here and then a little bit there, and then a little bit in a third place and then in a fourth place, well, you'll never get to water that way. You have to have some consistency in your digging. You have to dig in the same place. Like you have to have some consistency in your practice to really get somewhere. But he said, on the other hand, in another talk, he said, always meditating exactly the same way is kind of like always eating the same food. Eventually, you're going to get really bored of it. And so you have to find some balance between the two, of also having some variety in your practice too. Another suggestion that people commonly find helpful is to have a community aspect in your practice. So if you have other people to meditate with, for example, if you don't have people you can meditate with in person there, maybe there's not a monastery around you or a meditation center, you could think about starting a little sitting group. If there isn't anybody else doing it, there are probably other people in your area who are interested in doing it and meditating with friends. Or you could log on for some of the guided meditations we do here at Empty Cloud, for example. It might help you feel like you're participating more in a community. So those are some ideas I can offer.
And just to overextend the digging holes metaphor,
Okay.
I'd also add that even if you're digging holes in multiple places, you're still developing arm strength. You're developing skill at digging. You're also getting some familiarity of what the conditions are like in different places, where it's easier to dig, where it's harder to dig, what tools are suitable in different conditions of ground. And you will still eventually reach water.
Eventually, that's right.
But you're not wasting your time as you're doing that because you're still developing some skill. Mm-hmm. So it's the same with meditation practice. Even if we try out many different methods and maybe we don't actually really get anywhere with many of those methods, we're still building up some general purpose meditation skills. And even if you just learn that a certain meditation method is not for you, then you still learned something. And that's a step in the right direction. Okay, and next question. So John says, do Buddhists have a duty to speak in praise of friendship and respect across sectarian lines? Does Sangha include those in other traditions with other views? So those are two slightly different questions. So first off, do Buddhists have a duty to speak in praise of friendship and respect across sectarian lines? Well, friendship and respect, friendliness and respectfulness are wholesome qualities which the Buddha praises. So being kind and respectful are powerful ways of training the mind that incline the mind towards awakening. Looking for the wholesome qualities in others and praising those wholesome qualities is also part of Buddhist practice. So yes, absolutely. We should be friendly and respectful to people outside of our own little corner of the spiritual world. And we should actively look for praiseworthy qualities in other practitioners and praise those qualities, appreciate those qualities. However, we also have a duty to learn and understand the Dhamma and to uphold the Dhamma. So being friendly and respectful across sectarian lines does not mean that you need to give in to wrong view. So if you actually sincerely believe that somebody else has a misunderstanding of Dhamma, then you can, in a friendly and respectful way, talk about it. So if you actually really think somebody has something wrong, then it's okay to say that You just learn how to say it in a way which is friendly and respectful. And again, it's really important to look for the wholesome traits, especially the wholesome traits in common, especially when dealing with other Buddhist traditions or other Buddhist lineages outside your own. You always want to look for the commonalities, because we actually do have a lot in common. It's good to remember that all the Buddhist traditions, no matter how strange and weird they might seem to you, all the Buddhist traditions ultimately trace back to the same person. They all trace back to Shakyamuni Buddha, to Gautama Buddha. So maybe they've changed a lot over the centuries, and maybe there's some things that you don't agree with so much, but look for the shared common ground. And starting from that place of shared appreciation, then it's easier to have a friendly, respectful conversation about the differences. And you might learn something in the process. There's several forms of Buddhism which I initially thought were just clearly, utterly heretical nonsense. But then in the course of having friendly, respectful conversations with experienced monks from those traditions, I came to appreciate what they're doing. I came to appreciate that they're still practicing Dhamma in another way. And does Sangha include those in other traditions with other views? So the word Sangha traditionally is used in two ways. So one is Sangha meaning any bhikkhu or bhikkhuni, and that would mean in any lineage, because once again, all the lineages come from the Buddha. So the Buddhist world is kind of like a tree. So the tree has one trunk, and that trunk is the Buddha, but many branches. So it's all one tree. It's not like each branch is a different tree. It's all one tree. So all the different branches of Buddhism are still just branches of the same tree. So every bhikkhu or bhikkhuni, whether they're in some Theravada form or Mahayana form or whatever, we're still all bhikkhus and bhikkhunis. We're part of the same extended family. And the other way the word Sangha is used is it's used to refer to people who have attained some stage of awakening. And anyone who's practicing the Eightfold Path can attain some stage of awakening. So there might be people with stages of awakening in any Buddhist tradition, as long as that tradition is still teaching the Eightfold Path, which is most of them. Most of them. Some of them have wandered off into left field a bit, but most of them are still teaching the Eightfold Path. Okay, and Moraya says, is doing anything out of desire or aversion always unwholesome? Can desire and aversion sometimes be skillful if it leads to good actions or away from harmful things? Bhante, what do you think?
Okay. Well, okay. Great question. It's Moraya? Is that right? It's Moraya. And so when you speak of desire or aversion, it sounds like you're talking about, of course, aversion is classified, usually understood as as dosa from the Pali, so one of the three roots of unskillful action, unwholesome action. And desire, we have desire talked about in a couple of ways in the suttas, kind of a wholesome ambition, or like a spiritual ambition, chanda, or the chanda sometimes also is used in a negative way, as more like we might usually translate as greed. We're talking about desire, desire sometimes is used as well, but just to clarify a little bit what we're talking about, they're talking about the two unskillful roots, two of the three being greed, aversion, and delusion. And so can something done with greed or aversion, or as we have desire, always be, could it be wholesome? Well, okay, so sometimes people might do something good with a desire to get something. For example, one thing that pops into my mind is when people practice generosity with the desire to get some kind of material benefit from it. And so, for example, if someone even is doing something pretty wholesome, or very wholesome, like giving away things for charity, or providing service work, or maybe making offerings at the monastery, they may be doing so with the desire to receive some material return, from the merit, from the good karma of doing a good deed like this. And typically, in Buddhism, we wouldn't talk about this as being as an unskillful kind of desire. they say that actually performing acts of generosity is necessary for us to have the material supports that we need in life. But there is this desire to be generous in order to receive this return. Similarly, we practice meditation because we want benefits from that. We want to have peace of mind, for example, or even attain enlightenment, or perhaps be reborn in a heavenly realm, so on like this. But doing it through the practice of meditation, we wouldn't say that this is coming from an unskillful root, an unskillful kind of greed. Similarly with generosity, as I was saying. But the unskillful desire, they would say something like desire for beautiful clothing, for example, as a sensual pleasure, or delicious foods. This in and of itself, we could say, would be coming from this unskillful root of greed, for example. But usually if you're practicing a spiritual activity in order to get good results in your life, then we would classify that more on the wholesome side. Aversion, so for example, if we're experiencing aversion to the suffering in life, or even real anger at our kilesas, our defilements, some meditators practice, have actually used their anger for all of the times anger has gotten them into trouble to motivate them to fight, to stamp out their defilements. So aversion can be looked at in that way, I suppose. Even samvega is considered quite a good quality in the suttas, for example, world weariness, which might be thought of a little bit as aversion, but this is actually in a skillful way, recognizing the unsatisfactory nature of the world and of formations and being caught in the round of rebirths. So this is a matter of distinguishing to a finer degree between the unskillful roots. In some ways, they're wholesome counterparts. Like the desire to give, the desire to engage in spiritual practice, or samvega, as I mentioned, as some examples.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, and we have a question here from Joe. So Joe says, investigating how metta is beneficial for suppressing craving for sense pleasure and craving for non-becoming. Could you share any insights on how metta can be used for craving for becoming? I confess I've never once thought of metta as being a practice to be used for reducing craving for becoming, craving for existence. Bhava tanha, I assume you're referring to. Nor is it normally talked about as a way of dealing with kama tanha or vibhava tanha. In fact, I've never actually seen metta related to any of the three forms of craving, so this is actually new to me. Metta is normally spoken about as a way of dealing with aversion, or as a way of cultivating a joyful samadhi, but as a way of dealing with desire for sensuality, desire for existence, desire for non-existence. I just never thought about it in that way. Do you have any thoughts on this? I'm drawing a total blank.
Yes, yeah, I've never thought of it in this way either. To tell you the truth, I wonder what Joe means by craving for becoming and non-becoming. I think there could be different definitions of these things depending on who you ask, and so I wonder if that might shed some light on it. I'd be interested also to hear what ideas you've come up with for suppressing craving for sense pleasures with metta. But,
yeah, it's actually often pointed out that metta, if used incorrectly, can increase one's desire for sensuality, because metta itself is a very pleasurable experience. So it can lead to actually an increase in sensuality if metta is not accompanied by wisdom and dispassion. So yeah, maybe Joe, if you can give a bit more information, then we can give a more useful answer. Okay, and Kumu says, in Majjhima Nikaya 41, Salayaka Sutta, it says, a person of principled and moral conduct wishes that they have a rebirth in any of the realms, including formless realms. It is possible. Could you please explain a bit more? Can you please explain Majjhima Nikaya 41 in terms of the wishes of a person to be born in a better realm or even a better birth in this human realm itself? I'd have to look at the sutta in context. So, Kumu, what I'd recommend is to write an email to the monastery email address requesting a sutta study on that sutta. And I'll go over it sometime in the next couple of weeks. I think that would be more appropriate rather than trying to give a short answer here. It'd be better to go over the sutta in appropriate detail. So write an email to the monastery requesting that sutta, and we'll put it on the schedule. Okay, and Anna Maria says, Pante Wade, your smile lights up the whole room. It's true. It's true. Like, he's teddy bear and I'm grumpy bear. Yeah, good cop and bad cop. That's a good pair. So, Bante Wade, your smile lights up the whole room. Oh, it just makes me want to give you a hug. So she asks, tips on how to be very straightforward, direct, and kind at the same time. Yes, I'm good at the straightforward, but not at the kind. So this is a question for you.
Oh. Okay, so. Okay, so. Well, I think for me, there may be different ways of interpreting this. I think for me, being straightforward doesn't mean you always have to say everything that's on your mind. Honesty doesn't mean always having to say everything that's on your mind or everything you think, like you wish you could say or something like this, But so it does take some discretion in seeing what really is useful to say and what can I say in a way that is kind, And then I might recommend actually researching, actually some communication styles like nonviolent communication, which would be hard to summarize really, but it's a very useful skill to learn how to communicate with people, as I say, in a nonviolent way. It's another way of saying this, I think, And there are several different teachers of nonviolent communication with a lot of different resources available. I think one thing to think about is if someone were to say something to me, how would I want them to say it? And you might put yourself in their shoes. For example, when thinking about if you want to say something to somebody else, well, how would this sound if somebody said it to me? And we also have to keep in mind that not everybody will receive things in the same way that we would. So we have to develop some sensitivity to different personality types and see, think about how well do I know this person and how they might receive what I say to them. I think it's also very useful to keep in mind that when we're speaking with other people that we may not fully understand the situation, where they're coming from, and as I mentioned, how they'll understand things. And so going into any conversation with someone with an understanding of uncertainty is very valuable. Let's see, there's a couple of tips that come off the top of my head. I think another thing that can be very helpful in general is having a regular meditation practice. And this is something I harp on to some extent, something I think I mentioned in every monk chat is the benefits of having a regular meditation practice. And having a full spiritual practice, practicing some generosity, keeping precepts, meditating regularly. These all help us to be kinder and gentler over time, and help us to grow in discernment as well, because good judgment is so important in so many aspects of life, including good communication. So there's some ideas I can offer you.
Yeah, we just had one caveat around nonviolent communication, which is that it's fairly culturally specific. So it was designed by and for people of Northern European culture and for middle-class Americans of Northern European descent. So for people within that particular demographic, it can be a useful tool. It tends to be less effective for people outside of that demographic, and particularly for people within one demographic communicating with people in a different demographic, then that also, the nonviolent communication tools are often less useful. So it's an interesting start, but it needs to be understood that it does have some rather specific limitations. Okay, and Julie says, There are monasteries that are in dangerous neighborhoods / cities / countries. Yes, in fact, our previous center was in one of the highest crime regions of New York City. One of the neighborhoods where there would be regular shootings happening. In fact, I remember shortly after we got that center, I remember I was laying in bed at night and I was like, oh, how interesting. The people in the neighborhood like to set off fireworks all year round. And I was telling this to somebody who lived in the area for years, and they were like, Bante, those aren't fireworks. And I was like, oh. And I later started to find out that a number of our neighbors were engaged in various less than legal activities. But the interesting thing was that none of them were hostile towards us. In fact, they kind of adopted us, and they actually seemed really happy to have monks in their neighborhood, even though most of them never came to our programs. They also were never violent or aggressive towards us at all. They actually seemed quite happy that we were there. So there is something about cultivating a heart of loving kindness, a heart of tolerance, a heart of compassion, a heart of equanimity, a heart of serenity, that it does give you a certain measure of protection, in that other people will just be less inclined to do anything nasty towards you. It's not perfect, so there have been cases of Buddhist monasteries being robbed. On the West Coast, there was a string of robberies of Buddhist temples. There was a gang of thieves that seemed to be specifically targeting Buddhist temples, which was unfortunate. There was one case about 20 or so years ago in Texas where somebody went in a Buddhist temple and shot the monks, which again is pretty horrific, but it does, once in a rare while, these things do happen. Of course, one of the major dark incidents in Buddhist history was the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, where the Cambodian government ordered the massacre of every Buddhist monk in the entire country. So one of the more extreme cases of specifically anti-Buddhist violence in our history. And there's been other cases, but generally speaking, if somebody is practicing kindness and compassion and tolerance and equanimity and peacefulness, then generally speaking, that does give you a certain measure of protection. So I personally do not feel threatened walking through dangerous areas because of my confidence in the Dhamma and in the power of the Dhamma, and also in knowing that even if something happens to me, that I have the necessary resources to keep my heart pure as best I can. And a related question, Julie says, on many occasions people attempted to take the life of the Buddha. There's actually only one occasion that I know of where that happened. Was there anything said on the Buddha's life being protected? So what is said in the suttas is that it is impossible to murder a Buddha. A Buddha cannot die by murder. They can die only of natural causes in their own time. But nobody has the ability to murder a Buddha. And it's never explained why. In the suttas that I'm aware of, it never explains why. It's just kind of stated matter-of-factly. Like, no one can murder a Buddha. It's just not possible. They do have a finite lifespan, and Buddhas will always eventually die, just like everybody else. But they can never die of murder, which I find interesting. So we could speculate as to why that is. I personally don't really see much value in speculating. I think it's just a manifestation of the Buddha's incredible karma, having built up a spiritual practice over hundreds of lifetimes, and it gets to a point where it's just not possible for somebody else to kill you, which is interesting. But I wouldn't lean too heavily into it, because arhants can be killed. It's just Buddhas that seem to be exempt from that. Okay, and Demsin asks, was there a concept of a week, a 7-day cycle in early Buddhism? When is considered the beginning of the year? How about the cycles of the moon, the month? Any mentions of significance? Bhante Wade?
I'm terrible at this stuff.
The Uposita days.
Maybe
the
Uposita
lunar
days.
quarters.
Let's see. I never really, yeah, so, let's see, what does it say in the sutras? It's on the, I forget what it says exactly. I know it falls on the lunar quarters. I look at the calendar to see when that is. We actually look it up on my weather app now here in the here in the monastery. So I'm really out of touch with the ancient calendar and how the moon phases work and so on like this. So I'm at a loss.
Well, I mean, just the general thing that we do see in the suttas is that apparently in the time of the Buddha there was a practice that people would do spiritual observances on every lunar quarter, which then means the lunar week, which is slightly longer than 7 days. It's about 7.5 days. And the Buddha adopted that same practice for the Buddhist community. So the idea was that every full moon, half moon, and new moon, that one would take a day to do spiritual practice, following extra precepts, doing more meditation, listening to Dhamma talks. So that is something that's been going on since the beginning. I personally never read any esoteric significance into it, but it's more a practical thing. So when you're living out in the forest, you just look up at the sky and you can see, oh, the moon's almost full. So in a day or two, we should meet to do our practice together. So it's just a practical thing. That's all I would really say on the matter.
I think they do mention years, at least in the English translations I've read, like talking about the lifespans of the Devas, for example, they mentioned they denominate it in years. And so they had the concept of year though, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's usually measured by the seasons. So they had the 3 seasons, the rainy season, the cold season, and the hot season. And so they would measure it by the rainy season. So rather than saying year, they normally would say rains. So also we still keep that in terms of how we count how long we've been a monk.
Oh, I see.
Like saying how many summers are you? It's
Okay.
like, oh, I'm 15 summers.
I thought that was just a monk thing. I didn't know that was amongst the general populace in India too. Wow. I didn't.
Yeah.
Okay. And how many lunar months did they have in a year?
Oh gosh, it's like 12 and a half or something.
Okay.
It doesn't line up perfectly with the solar calendar.
Okay. Yes. Right. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yes.
yeah, the solar calendar is actually a little bit awkward. The lunar calendar actually makes a lot more sense. I think we should just use the lunar calendar. Okay, and actually the months that we follow these days are just completely insane. Like, why do some have 28 days and some have 30 and some have 31? Like, who comes up with this
It's
stuff?
confusing. I forgot that rhyme from elementary school.
Yeah. Yeah, we need something systematic and logical. Metric calendars.
That's right.
Okay, so Gregor has a question. He says, what kind of meditation do you recommend for me? I have psychosis and take medication for it. I do Satipatthana meditation, Mahasi Sayadaw technique, but one teacher said one should go off meditation.
Medication, I think.
Medication.
Okay.
But that is not possible in my case. So is it possible to have insight with medication? So Gregor, this is a much too complex of topic to give a straightforward answer online. This is something which would be much better to talk about with monks that you can meet with in person and have thorough explanation of your condition and what you're experiencing. I will say I'm actually quite hesitant about recommending Mahasi-style Satipatthana to someone with psychosis. That doesn't really necessarily seem like the best option. I would probably actually recommend loving-kindness meditation above everything else. Loving-kindness meditation and mindfulness of the body. Those are the 2 methods that I would really recommend. I actually wouldn't recommend trying to do Vipassana practices, at least at this point in time, because it might actually make your psychosis worse. Whereas things like loving-kindness meditation and cultivating a clear awareness of your body, those are very safe, grounding practices that are hard to go wrong with. So I'd more recommend things like that. But again, it's not good to give recommendations over the internet around delicate situations like yours. It's really better for you to meet with monks in person and develop an ongoing relationship with some monks in person. And based upon that, then they'll be able to give you more specifically relevant advice. rather than what we might say offhand over the internet. Go ahead.
I wonder if I might address another aspect of this question about
Yeah.
going off medication. It sounds like he's saying that he was advised to go off medication in order to meditate. Like if he's going to meditate, then he should go off medication. And I think, personally, I don't know what you think, Bhante, I think in general you wouldn't want to go off medication unless advised to by a qualified prescriber. If you feel like you want to get a second opinion, or a third opinion even on whether or not you should, from mental health professionals, whether or not you should be taking medication, I think that would be wise. But I think in general, Buddhist monks, I wonder what you think, Bhante, really shouldn't be advising on whether you should take your psychiatric medications.
I'm not going to speak for other monks, but just personally, I do not. As a rule, I don't tell people to stop taking their medication. What I tell people is, like Bhante Wade was saying, that if you want to stop taking your medication, then you need to talk to your doctor first. Like just being like, well, the monk said to stop taking my pills, so I stopped taking them. That would be irresponsible. So if you talk with your doctor and your doctor concludes that maybe it's okay for you to reduce or even stop your medication, well, that's okay. But it has to be, you have to have that conversation with your doctors. It shouldn't be advice coming from the monks. So I'm not a pharmacist, I'm not a medical doctor. I don't have a thorough understanding of how different chemicals affect the body and brain. So I cannot give advice. And most Buddhist monks also do not have sufficient medical knowledge to give that advice. There's a couple of monks I know who actually do have a background either in medicine or in psychotherapy, and they might be able to give more specific advice around medications, but I certainly can't, and most monks can't. Yeah, there's a bhikkhuni I know who was a medical doctor for many years before becoming a monk. There's a bhikkhu I know who has a degree in psychology. People like that might be able to say something a bit more relevant. But I always just tell people to talk to their doctor about their medications. Okay, so Joe is giving a bit more information. He says, warm-heartedness is a happiness that makes sense pleasure less attractive. One is content inwardly. Metta as compassion subdues thoughts of self-harm, and was thinking but looking for more feedback on how as Mudita Metta suppresses craving for becoming in the form of craving for social status and fame when they can find joy in the success of others. Something like that? Okay, do you want to speak about this now?
Well, it was very interesting, and I think creative ways of looking at these things. And so, craving for becoming. So, reading through it again a little bit more. You're asking for advice on metta as an antidote to craving for becoming. I'm trying to remember the original question. And I think maybe you mentioned non-becoming as well was one that you... Okay, maybe you're asking about non-becoming as an answer to non-becoming in the original question. And no, so but this is very interesting. So you were thinking of becoming a little bit differently than I did. And so that if you're... And I think that yeah, sure, that actually, right, you're saying with practicing metta, then you have a sense of fulfillment with regard to many kinds of things, whether it's sensual pleasures or status in life and so on like this. If you practice metta, then perhaps also you will feel more comfortable doing a variety of things and fulfilling a variety of roles in life that you might initially not really want to. So if you practice loving kindness meditation, this may give you also this sense of feeling of happiness, some joy, or some fulfillment in life, so that you're okay with doing things you might not normally want to, and therefore you wouldn't, or fulfilling roles you might not want to, therefore you won't be oppressed by a craving for non-becoming. So, and so that's a great way of using metta, I think, and of spiritual practice in general, that providing a sense of fulfillment in life and pleasure that makes us feel comfortable in a variety of kinds of situations, and so we have greater self-control and self-direction. So yeah, that's an idea I can offer. Yeah, great work, Joseph.
Good. Okay. Okay, let's see. And Amin says, I am noticing all three poisons in me now. Before I thought I was an angry person, now I'm noticing that I have lots of greed. Is this because of my meditation? So the truth is that every unawakened person has all three root defilements. Every unawakened person has a mixture of greed, aversion, and delusion. All of us do. However, normally, one of these three is stronger than the other two. So knowing which one is stronger can give you some sense as to what to focus a bit more effort on in your practice. And as you start to develop more self-awareness, and as you start to diminish your dominant defilement, then you will start to become more aware of the other two in your mind. So they were always there, it's just that now you're starting to become more aware of them. So yes, that's normal as your practice develops. So maybe in the beginning you think you're a very irritable, grumpy person, and you practice really well for many years, and then you realize that you're full of greed. Well, that's actually a good sign, because it's a sign that you've got your aversion under a bit more control, and you've also developed a bit more self-awareness. So now you're starting to recognize the greed that was there all along. It's just now it's easier for you to see it. So that's good. That means now you can work on diminishing your greed as well. And eventually you'll also start to become aware of your delusion tendencies. Those are usually the hardest ones to see, and the ones that take the most work to overcome. But eventually you'll start to see those as well, and you can start working on those as well. So it's good news, actually. So discovering that your mind is full of greed, it may not seem like good news, but it's actually good news, because it means that now you can do something about it. And Mariah says, did the Buddha ever give teachings that were meant just for bhikkhunis and did not apply to bhikkhus or vice versa? No. No, everything, all the teachings the Buddha gave are applicable regardless of gender. So this is true across the board. So when we look at the Buddha's teachings, there doesn't seem to be any concept of a fundamental root difference between genders. We all have greed, hatred, and delusion. We all have greed, hatred, and delusion in basically the same ways. We all have the need to practice the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path, again, in more or less the same way. We all need to cultivate Sila, Samadhi, and Panya, again, in pretty much the same way. We all need to cultivate a direct perception of the three characteristics, again, pretty much the same way. So no, there doesn't seem to be any strong distinction between genders in terms of how one practices the Buddhist teachings. It's pretty much the same for everyone. What can vary from person to person, depending upon each person's specific personality traits or specific habits and tendencies, is the practice might vary a little bit because it's customized for each person's specific needs. And then that can lead to the appearance of gender differences just because of the culture-based differences in how people are raised. So if in a particular culture men are taught to act a certain way and women are taught to act a certain way, then that might create certain tendencies, certain defilement patterns, and then that might lead to slightly different practices being done. But the core principles are the same. And again, it's about targeting particular defilements or particular behavior patterns rather than particular genders. And Alex says, what is the reasoning behind honoring one's parents no matter what? What do you think?
Okay, so well, if we say reasoning, it's a word that I pause over immediately. There are kind of rational explanations provided within Buddhism, but there may be more to it than really we could work out by reason. Also, I think, because a major reason is karma, and it says in the suttas. To my knowledge, the masters uphold this as well, that only a Sammasambuddha can fully understand the workings of karma because it's so complex. But they say that it is terribly bad karma to do anything against your parents, to kind of violate them in some way or other. And so the recommendation is always to be very polite to them, and to be respectful towards them, and actually it's your duty. That a child has many duties with regard to their parents, to take care of them, look after them, and so on like this as well. I mean, this is partly is this karmic grounding that there's a strong karmic relationship between a parent and the child. In fact, in the suttas, it's actually the parents are actually placed in some ways on par with the Buddhas and the Arhats, one's own parents, that is. So, for example, killing one's mother or father is grievously bad karma as killing an Arhat, an enlightened being, for example. In another sutta, the Buddha likens parents to the first teachers, so like the root teachers of a lineage, or to Brahma, the very highest divinity in the cosmos, or one of the highest, depending on how you look at it, I think. And so it's really bad karma to violate one's parents. And if we talk about it in terms of reason, I think that we might say that something that's often pointed to is how much parents do for us. So, for example, the mother carries a child in the womb for 9 or 10 months or something like this, and this is quite a burden that the mother undertakes. And then all of the many things that the parents do for children. As it says in the suttas, the parents introduce children to the world, And so in this way also they're like a first teacher, like a root teacher of a lineage for their child. And if we think about it, who else in our lives does as much for us as a parent does in terms of all the physical supports and all the training that they give to a child. Now, different parents and children have different relationships, and every parent-child relationship is different. I'm quite privileged to come from a very good parent-child relationship, and so I hesitate to say how people should feel about their parents, but this is the kind of thing that's taught about parent-child relationships within Buddhism, and so I can offer these for consideration. Another idea came to mind also, and maybe I should add in as well. So this is good. Is that the love that parents have for their children is also quite a distinguishing characteristic. That is quite hard to find anybody else in life who will love someone as much as their own mother and father do. To the extent that the Buddha used the example of one's mother in the Karanita Metta Sutta, the Sutta on loving kindness. With the mother's love offered as the kind of the paragon, the supreme example, that we should cherish all living beings as a mother does her own child, and she would protect her own child with her own life. And so this, again, as I said, is something very special and something that's very hard to find. And so that's why parents have a special place for us. So that's what I can offer.
Okay. And Christina says, what type of meditation would be recommended to someone who has delusion as a major defilement? Mindfulness of the body. This is the number one really critical one. Constant, clear awareness of your body at all times. That really, really, really helps enormously. And just keep coming back to focusing on your body. Don't let the mind wander. Don't let the mind drift. Constant, sharp awareness of your own body. Walking meditation can also be quite helpful for exactly this reason. So it's harder to space out and drift off and daydream when you're doing walking meditation, though it's still possible. But you'll get more clues when the mind is wandering. And Karuna says, I've been taught that images and words of the Buddha should be handled with reverence, including in their disposal, specifically that only burning is acceptable. Do we have the same obligation with our own translation exercises? I don't have easy access to a fire. Also, is it disrespectful to translate suttas onto steno pads or post-its? Well, first off, it's important to keep in mind that all of these rules and regulations were created hundreds and hundreds of years after the Buddha, because during the time of the Buddha, people weren't writing these things down and there were no images of the Buddha. Therefore, in early Buddhism, there are no regulations about handling or disposal of Buddha images or sutta translations or anything like that. So the rules and regulations that you come across should be taken as suggestions and examples. The underlying attitude of respect is what's important, not the specific manifestation. So this is actually connected to the idea of sila bhatta paramasa, misunderstanding of spiritual practices. Sila bhatta paramasa would be thinking the only possible way to dispose of a Buddha image or a sutta is through burning. That is sila bhatta paramasa. Instead, to think, it is important to cultivate respect and reverence for Buddha and Dhamma, and it is important to express that respect and reverence through action. That, on the other hand, is a correct understanding. Burning is maybe one way. For somebody else, burning might actually be a way of showing disrespect. They collect up all the sutta books and throw them on a fire. Well, that's not very nice. Or they take all your posters and images of the Buddha and incinerate them. Well, that's not very nice. So just the act of burning something does not indicate respect. And also, if you have translation efforts and you need to dispose of them, well, then just dispose of them in whatever way makes the most sense. But making sure that your attitude is one of respect. So not just like, oh, disgusting words of the Buddha in the trash with you, but instead more like, oh, it's been so delightful that I've had this time together with the Buddha's words, and it's time for me to remove these extra materials so I can focus on using my space in other ways for practicing Dhamma. So it's important not to get too superstitious about these things, but rather always to remember that the point of these sorts of recommended regulations is to help us cultivate a mind of respect and reverence for Buddha and Dhamma. So it's not the specific practice that matters, it's the attitude of respect that matters. And as for translating suttas onto steno pads or post-its, go for it. As long as you're learning the Dhamma, learning Pali, doing translations of suttas, that's great. Keep it up. Like, I don't care if you're doing it in chalk on the sidewalk. Like, keep it up. Or finger paint on the walls. Keep it up. Like, anything is fine as long as it keeps you focused on the Dhamma. And Kumu says, in Michaditi, the list of 10 wrong views, what is meant by the 2 wrong views? There is no mother and there's no father. Well, actually, Bhante Wade was just talking about that. So the attitude, there is no mother and there is no father, is the idea that there's nothing special about our parents, and there's nothing special about our relationship with our parents. That our parents are just 2 random people like any other random people in the world. So that's those wrong views. It's the wrong view of thinking that there's nothing special about one's relationship to one's parents. Okay, so Soma Drums says, what are your thoughts on what the Buddha means when he said the mind is luminous? I see it as another way of saying the natural state of our mind is nirvana. I assume you're referring to this one cryptic and heavily debated line from the Anguttara Nikaya, where the Buddha says, papasarang chittang, so usually translated, the mind is luminous. And then the Buddha goes on to say, but it is darkened by visiting defilements. So people sometimes take that line to mean that the natural state of the mind is purity. The mind is inherently pure and bright. That the defilements are not the nature of the mind. They're just things which obscure the purity of the mind. And there's a useful way of talking in that way. But it's important not to be misunderstood. But there is some value to one's practice in relating to it that way, because then it's like, well, if I just stop feeding the defilements, then the mind will naturally start to revert to a state of purity. That is one way of practicing which can be useful. And Scott says, please, Venerables, extra metta for November election time. Trust me, Scott, I have metta every month of the year. Don't worry about it. Scott, have metta for yourself as well. And Moriah says, do you think that parents who actively abandon or mistreat their children would create extra bad karma? What do you think?
Okay. Do you think that parents who actively abandon or mistreat their children would create extra bad karma? Meaning worse karma than actively abandoning or mistreating other people other than their children, perhaps. I have to say I don't know. But actively abandoning, so we say abandon. According to the suttas, it is a duty of parents to kind of look after their children, also train them, and so on like this. And that's a higher, that's a duty that we don't have to just anyone, of course. That people don't have to just anyone, but to their children, they have that duty. And so in that way, there's an extra responsibility there. You can leave other people, many other people in life you can leave or not take responsibility for, but for your own children, you're supposed to take responsibility. I suppose, of course, there'd be a difference if you can't really take care of the child, for a suitable reason or other. But in terms of mistreating, I don't know if it's if a parent mistreats their own child, if it's worse bad karma than if they mistreat somebody else. But I think that how you look at this might depend on your relative situation, your relationship to the situation. I don't know if you're asking about something that somebody else is doing, or something that if you're wondering about something that you may have done. I hate to put it so directly like that, but and we've all made mistakes in our lives, and so and regret can be a difficult thing to live with, and so how to interact with this may depend on your relationship to the situation, and so forward looking, we would say, that we don't want to make any bad karma, preferably, and so we try to be good at guarding our minds and having restraint, at least is the first barrier to doing bad karma. And then developing skillful mental states so we don't have the inclination towards it as well. And if we've done something that we regret, then we recognize that, and we recognize it and own it, you might say. Okay, that this is something that I did. We take responsibility for it in that way, internally. And then we can remember that that's similar for everyone. Everyone's done things that they feel like they shouldn't have done. And so in that way, we're all human, and this is normal. And so we remember this, and we can forgive ourselves and make a determination going forward. This is kind of the, and perhaps a confession as well, to someone that we trust or someone that we admire, and confess that we've done something wrong, and make a determination that we will try to do better in the future. This is actually a practice that the monks have. It's actually codified in our code of conduct that we do this on a regular basis, the monks with each other, making confessions and promising to try to do better in the future. So this is a very Buddhist way of doing it. And then we start over again, and we put it behind us, we let it go of it.
Great. And that's the last question online, so I think we can go ahead and conclude the monk chat at this point. So much appreciation for all of your questions and discussion, and we can conclude the session with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And just a reminder that you're all welcome to submit requests for specific suttas for our weekly sutta study sessions, and we'll see you next week.